The baby's cry shattered the Montana dawn like a gunshot through glass. But it wasn't the sound that stopped Thomas Whitmore's heart. It was the silver ring glinting around the infant's neck. His dead wife's wedding ring. The one he'd buried with Sarah 3 winters ago. Thomas had sworn on her grave that he'd never hold another child. He'd failed too many already, and the guilt had nearly killed him. But when those tiny fingers reached toward the rising sun, he knew with cold certainty that losing this one would finish what the guilt had started. The ring was impossible. Sarah's turquoise and silver band, complete with the small chip from when she'd knocked it against the well pump. Thomas had kissed that ring goodbye before sealing the coffin with his own hands. He'd watched the dirt cover it, had stood vigil through the first night, had sworn no one would ever disturb her rest. So how was it here? On a baby who couldn't be more than 6 months old? A baby whose dark eyes seemed to know him? Before we jump back in, comment where you're tuning in from. And if this story has touched you, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as he stared at the impossible sight on his porch. The baby was wrapped in a blanket woven with patterns he recognized from the Crow Reservation, geometric designs that told stories of bloodlines and sacred promises. But it was the cry that made his hands shake. He'd heard it before, in the nightmares that had haunted him since Maria Crow Feather died in his custody. The same desperate wail that had echoed through his dreams for 3 years, the sound of innocence calling for protection he'd failed to provide. This time, though, the cry was real, and it was right outside his door. The sun crested the eastern ridge at exactly 6:17, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Thomas knew because he'd been watching from his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, waiting for the light to chase away another sleepless night. The ritual never varied. Sunrise, coffee, check the boundaries, tend the horses, repair whatever the wind had broken, eat beans from a can, sleep when exhaustion finally overcame memory. It was a life built around forgetting, and it had been working until this morning. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the pine floor as he stared at the impossible sight on his porch. A baby, maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a blanket woven with geometric patterns he recognized from the Crow Reservation 20 miles east. But it wasn't the blanket that made his hands shake. It was the silver ring catching the early light, suspended on a thin leather cord around the infant's neck. Sarah's ring. The turquoise and silver band he'd slipped onto her finger the day they married. The same ring that bore a small chip from when she'd knocked it against the well pump while drawing water for her garden. The ring he'd kissed goodbye before placing it on her cold fingers in the coffin he'd built with his own hands. Thomas's legs gave out, and he sank into the wooden chair by the window. For 3 years, he'd protected himself from hope, from connection, from the possibility of failing someone else the way he'd failed as Marshall Thomas Whitmore. But seeing that ring, Sarah's ring, on a living child's chest cracked something open inside him that he'd sealed with guilt and isolation. The baby's cry came again, stronger now, and Thomas found himself moving toward the door despite every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden. He'd learned that caring meant losing, that protection meant failure, that hope meant heartbreak. But the child's wail cut through his defenses like wine through winter wheat. When he opened the door, the baby's dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made Thomas's breath catch. Those eyes knew him. Somehow, impossibly, this child recognized him. "Who left you here, little one?" Thomas whispered, kneeling beside the bundle. The baby reached up with tiny fists, and Thomas felt tears he'd refused to shed for 3 years burning his eyes. "Where did you get Sarah's ring?" The morning wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, along with something else, the sound of hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats, moving with the steady rhythm of riders who'd traveled far and weren't planning to leave empty-handed. That's when Thomas heard the horses, and his blood turned to ice water. A dozen riders crested the hill behind his ranch house, silhouetted against the climbing sun. Even at this distance, Thomas recognized the lead rider's straight-backed posture and the eagle feather in his braided hair. Joseph Crow Feather, chief of the Eastern Bands, and a man Thomas had hoped never to see again. Behind Joseph rode representatives from tribes that barely acknowledged each other's existence. Lakota with their distinctive war paint, Cherokee in traditional dress, Cheyenne warriors with coup feathers Apache scouts with faces like carved stone. Nations that had fought each other for generations were riding together toward his isolated ranch. The baby in his arms, because somehow Thomas had lifted the child without realizing it, cooed softly and reached toward the approaching riders. The sound went straight to Thomas's heart, awakening the protective instinct that had nearly destroyed him once before. "Easy, little one," Thomas murmured, rocking the child instinctively. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The word surprised him. For 3 years, he'd faced everything alone. Joseph Crow Feather dismounted with the deliberate grace of a man who'd spent 70 winters learning when to show strength and when to show restraint. His weathered face carried lines of grief that Thomas recognized, the kind that came from burying children and grandchildren while corrupt men prospered. "Thomas Whitmore," Joseph said, using the name Thomas hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. The other riders remained mounted, hands resting near weapons but not threatening. "Yet, you have something that belongs to us." "The child stays with me," Thomas said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. The protective instinct he'd tried to bury was rising like floodwater, unstoppable and fierce. "That child," Joseph said carefully, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face, "is why 12 nations have ridden together for the first time in 50 years. Do you understand what that means?" Thomas understood exactly what it meant. He also understood why they'd come now, 3 years after he'd stopped being Marshal Thomas Whitmore and started being just another broken rancher hiding in the Montana wilderness. They'd come because of the ring around the baby's neck and because of what that ring represented. They'd come because of Maria. "The ring," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Joseph's weathered features hardened like river stone. "My granddaughter was buried wearing that ring. She was carrying our future when your justice failed her." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each one reopening wounds he'd tried to cauterize with isolation and guilt. Maria Crow Feather, age 19, the brightest light of her generation. The young woman who'd witnessed a massacre that implicated half the territorial government. The woman he'd sworn to protect until she could testify before the federal commission. The woman who'd died in his custody when corrupt officials discovered her location and murdered her in the night. "Maria's baby died with her," Thomas said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. He'd held Maria's cold body, had seen the blood, had buried her with his own hands while her family keened their grief under the Montana stars. "Maria's baby disappeared," Joseph corrected, and something in his tone made Thomas look down at the infant in his arms with new understanding. "The night before she was killed, she gave birth in secret. Someone got the child to safety before the killers came." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The baby's dark hair, the intelligent eyes, the way the child had reached toward the sunrise as if greeting something familiar. Suddenly it all made terrible, beautiful sense. "Someone who knew she might not survive to raise him," Joseph continued, his gaze fixed on the ring around the baby's neck. "Someone who wanted to ensure our future would live even if our present was murdered." Thomas's mind raced backward through the nights before Maria's death, through the fevered dreams and confused memories of his wife's final days. Sarah had been dying of consumption, her breathing labored, her mind sometimes wandering between present and past. But in her lucid moments, she'd spoken of a young woman who needed help, of a birth that had to be kept secret, of a ring that would protect a child. He'd thought it was delirium. He'd been wrong. Sarah delivered him. Thomas whispered, the truth settling over him like sunrise after the longest night. "My wife helped birth Maria's son, and she gave him her ring to keep him safe." "Your wife was a good woman," Joseph said simply. "She understood what we've all learned too late, that the only way to protect our children is to trust those who will love them regardless of blood." A new voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. How touching. A regular family reunion. Thomas spun toward the voice and felt his blood freeze in his veins. Agent Harrison Blackwood stepped out from behind the barn, flanked by 6 territorial marshals in dusty uniforms. The same man who'd leaked Maria's location 3 years ago. The same man whose corruption Thomas had been gathering evidence against when Maria died. The same man who'd ensured Thomas's disgrace and exile to prevent him from pursuing justice. "Marshal Whitmore," Blackwood said with a cold smile that never reached his pale eyes. "Or do you prefer Thomas these days? Either way, you have something I need." The baby began to fuss, sensing the tension in Thomas's arms, and Thomas found himself rocking the child automatically. The motion felt natural, right? As if he'd been meant to hold this particular child all along. The boy doesn't know anything, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He's just a baby. The boy, Blackwood corrected, his smile widening, is proof that Maria Crow Feather lived long enough to give birth. Proof that her testimony could have brought down half the territorial government if she'd lived to deliver it. More importantly, he's the leverage I need to keep these 12 tribes from uniting against me. Thomas felt the familiar weight of his Colt at his hip, the gun he'd sworn never to draw again after his failure cost Maria her life. His right hand twitched toward the weapon, but he forced himself to remain still. One wrong move, and the child in his arms would be caught in crossfire. You killed her to keep her quiet, Thomas said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I killed her to save my career, Blackwood replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. But you, Marshall, you killed her by trusting the wrong people, by believing you could protect everyone, by thinking your righteousness could overcome political reality. The accusation landed like it always did, because Thomas knew it was true. He'd trusted his fellow marshals. He'd believed in the system. He'd let Maria die because he'd been naive enough to think justice mattered more than money, that truth could triumph over corruption through proper channels. But looking down at Maria's son, at the child his dying wife had risked everything to save, Thomas realized something fundamental had changed. This wasn't about his guilt anymore. This was about the future this boy represented, about the bridge Sarah had built between two worlds with her final act of love. The tribes won't let you take him, Thomas said quietly. Blackwood's laugh was like breaking glass. The tribes are outnumbered and outgunned. They came here expecting to negotiate for the child. Instead, they're going to watch you hand him over, or watch me burn this whole valley to get what I want. You're forgetting something, Joseph said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd led warriors through decades of impossible battles. What's that, old man? You're not just threatening the child now. Joseph's weathered hand moved to the rifle across his saddle. You're threatening the man who saved him, the man whose wife died protecting our future. That's when Thomas understood why 12 tribes had ridden together for the first time in 50 years. Not just for Maria's son, but because Sarah's final act had created something unprecedented. A bridge between the white lawman who'd failed them and the child who represented their hope. The standoff stretched like a taut rope while morning shadows shortened and the sun climbed higher. Thomas could feel the baby's heartbeat against his chest, steady and trusting, and wondered how long it had been since anyone had depended on him for protection. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, to be exact. Not since Maria. Put the child down, Whitmore, Blackwood said, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Walk away like you did before, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing. Like I did before. Thomas felt something cold and sharp unfurling in his chest. I didn't walk away. You destroyed my career, my reputation, and my marriage when I got too close to the truth about your activities. Your marriage was already dying, Blackwood sneered. Consumption took your wife, not me. I just made sure you understood the consequences of interfering with business arrangements that were bigger than your small-town sense of justice. Thomas's grip tightened on the baby, and he felt Maria's son stir in his arms. Such a small thing, this child, but Thomas could feel the weight of history in his tiny body. The future of 12 tribes, the legacy of a murdered woman, the final gift of a dying wife, all wrapped in a blanket and depending on a broken-down ex-marshal who'd failed everyone who'd ever trusted him. Tell me something, Blackwood, Thomas said, his voice deceptively calm. How did you know Maria was pregnant? How did you know exactly when to strike? Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. What does it matter now? It matters because someone told you. Someone Maria trusted. Thomas looked around at the tribal representatives, noting how they'd positioned themselves in a loose circle around Blackwood's men. These weren't just grieving relatives. These were warriors who'd been planning this confrontation for 3 years. Someone who's been feeding you information about tribal movements, about which leaders could be trusted, about when the nations might finally unite. One of Blackwood's marshals shifted nervously in his saddle, and Thomas caught the movement. Deputy Frank Morrison, a man Thomas had once considered a friend. A man who'd been present at every briefing about Maria's protection, who'd known about the safe house, who'd had access to all the intelligence about tribal politics. "Hello, Frank," Thomas said quietly. "Still taking Blackwood's money?" Morrison's face flushed red above his badge. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Tom. Maria wasn't supposed to die. We just needed her testimony delayed until after the commission moved on." "But she wouldn't cooperate," Thomas guessed. "She insisted on telling the truth, so you had to silence her permanently. She was going to destroy everything." Morrison exploded. "The railroad contracts, the mining rights, the settlement agreements, millions of dollars in legitimate business deals that happened to benefit some important people. Her testimony would have unraveled years of careful negotiations. Her testimony would have exposed years of systematic theft and murder," Joseph said coldly. "My granddaughter died because she witnessed your business associates burning villages and killing children to clear land for your railroad." Thomas felt pieces clicking together in his mind like chambers in a revolver. The Sweetgrass Massacre. That's what Maria saw, wasn't it? Not just random violence, but a planned campaign to drive the tribes off land that held mineral rights. Mineral rights that were legally purchased, Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its smugness. "From men who had no authority to sell them," Joseph replied. "Chiefs who were bought or threatened into signing away their people's birthright. My granddaughter saw the soldiers who carried out those orders. She saw the gold that changed hands. She could have identified every man involved, from the lowest private to the highest official." Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms, Maria's son, the child who carried the blood of witnesses in his veins. "That's why you need him dead. Not just to prevent testimony, but to eliminate the bloodline that could someday seek justice." "The boy will never be safe as long as I'm alive," Blackwood admitted. "Neither will any of you. This conversation has gone on long enough." He raised his hand, and Thomas saw the marshals reach for their weapons. Time slowed to honey-thick seconds as Thomas calculated angles, distances, cover. The baby in his arms made everything impossible. He couldn't draw fast enough, couldn't find cover quickly enough, couldn't protect everyone who needed protecting. Just like before, just like with Maria. But then something extraordinary happened. The tribal warriors didn't wait for Thomas to make the first move. Moving with coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning, they struck simultaneously. Joseph's rifle spoke first, taking Morrison from his saddle before the corrupt deputy could clear leather. Two Lakota warriors flanked the barn, cutting off Blackwood's retreat. A Cherokee archer put an arrow through another marshal's shoulder, spinning him from his horse. Thomas found himself in the center of a carefully orchestrated assault, protected by men who'd once considered him their enemy. The baby in his arms never cried, as if understanding that silence meant survival. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but Thomas felt every second stretch like hours. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Blackwood's men lay dead, 2 were wounded and surrendering, and Morrison was gutshot and dying in the dust beside his horse. Blackwood himself stood with his hands raised, surrounded by warriors who looked eager to finish what their granddaughter's murder had started. "Wait," Thomas said, stepping forward with Maria's son still cradled in his arms. "He doesn't die easy. He dies in court, with everyone watching, with his corruption exposed for the world to see." "The courts are part of his network," Joseph said grimly. "He'll buy his way out or disappear before trial." "Not if we have the right evidence," Thomas replied. "Not if we have witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought." He looked around at the assembled tribes, at the unprecedented alliance that Blackwood's greed had forged. 12 nations riding together. When was the last time that happened? And what message does it send to Washington when it happens again? Joseph's weathered face slowly creased into something that might have been a smile. "You're thinking like a marshal again, Thomas Whitmore." "I'm thinking like a father," Thomas corrected, looking down at the baby who'd slept peacefully through the violence. "This boy deserves to grow up in a world where justice means something." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Thomas's yard as the impromptu war council gathered on his porch. Maria's son, Samuel, Joseph had named him, meaning God has heard, slept in a makeshift cradle Thomas had fashioned from Sarah's sewing basket. The sight of the baby surrounded by her quilts and fabric scraps made Thomas's chest tight with emotions he'd forgotten how to name. Blackwood sat bound to a chair, blood seeping from a graze on his temple where a Cherokee war club had kissed him. His remaining marshals were secured in the barn under guard, except for Morrison, who died cursing Thomas's name and swearing his actions had been patriotic. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it hadn't been written in so much blood. "We need to understand the full scope of this conspiracy," Thomas said, studying the papers they'd found in Blackwood's saddlebags. "These aren't just local corruption. These contracts involve railroad companies from Denver, mining consortiums from San Francisco, territorial officials from Helena. This goes all the way to Washington." Joseph sat cross-legged beside the cradle, his gnarled fingers gently adjusting Samuel's blanket. "My granddaughter died because she could identify the soldiers who carried out the Sweetgrass Massacre. But what exactly did she see that was worth killing for?" "More than soldiers," Thomas said, unfolding a detailed map marked with survey stakes and mineral claims. She saw the advance teams marking claims before the attacks, saw civilian surveyors working with military units, saw gold changing hands between army officers and private investors. She witnessed the systematic theft of an entire territory. One of the Lakota warriors, a man named Standing Bear who wore lieutenant stripes from his cavalry service, leaned forward to study the documents. "These claims cover every major river valley from here to the Yellowstone. Millions of acres that were never ceded by treaty. Because the treaties were fraudulent," Thomas realized, pieces falling into place like cards in a crooked dealer's deck. They found chiefs desperate enough to sign anything, or they forged signatures entirely. Then they used military force to enforce agreements that never legally existed. Blackwood laughed bitterly from his chair. "You think you've discovered something profound? This is how the West gets won, Marshall. Someone has to make the hard decisions, take the necessary actions. Civilization doesn't advance through kindness and negotiations. Civilization advances through law and justice," Thomas replied coldly. "Through honoring agreements and protecting the innocent. Through ensuring children like Samuel can grow up without fear of being murdered for their bloodline. That child," Blackwood spat, "represents the failure of progress. As long as these people maintain their claims to this land, as long as they resist integration into American society, there will be conflict. My methods ensure peace through strength." Joseph's voice carried the weight of 70 winters when he replied, "Your methods ensure profit through genocide. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to understand it." Thomas stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the valley where Sarah had planned to plant her garden, where she'd dreamed of watching children play among the wildflowers. The irony wasn't lost on him. The child who might finally bring justice to this land had been protected by his dying wife's final act of love. "We have enough evidence to expose the entire network," he said finally. "Names, dates, financial records, maps showing the coordination between civilian and military operations." But Joseph's right. Territorial courts can't be trusted. Too many judges are either bought or intimidated. "So what do you propose?" Standing Bear asked. Thomas turned back to face the assembled group, his gaze settling on Samuel's sleeping form. "We take it to the federal authorities. Not the territorial government, but directly to Washington. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the Secretary of War, the press. We make this so public, so documented, that it can't be covered up or explained away." "And who carries this evidence to Washington?" Joseph asked. "Who has the credibility to be believed, the connections to reach the right people?" Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like Sarah's wedding shawl. A federal marshal who was discredited for getting too close to the truth. A man whose wife died protecting the evidence of systematic corruption. A man who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by seeing justice done. He knelt beside Samuel's cradle, and the baby's dark eyes opened, fixing on Thomas's face with that uncanny recognition. "But first, this boy needs proper protection. Not just from Blackwood's remaining associates, but from everyone who profits from the current system." "He'll have it," Joseph said simply. 12 nations rode together to bring him home. 12 nations will ride together to keep him safe. "It's not enough," Thomas said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "He needs legal protection too. Adoption papers, citizenship documentation, a legal guardian who can't be dismissed or intimidated." The silence stretched long enough for Thomas to hear his own heartbeat, to feel the magnitude of what he was proposing. He'd spent 3 years avoiding responsibility, fleeing from the possibility of failing someone else. Now he was volunteering to make himself responsible for the most important child in the territory. "You want to adopt him?" Joseph said. It wasn't a question. "I want to give him every legal protection available," Thomas replied. "And I want to give myself a reason to see this through to the end, no matter how dangerous it gets." Joseph studied Thomas's face for a long moment, then looked down at Samuel, who had reached up to grasp Thomas's finger with tiny fists. "Maria would have liked that," he said finally. "She always said the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living." 3 days later, Thomas sat in his kitchen writing the most important letter of his life, while Samuel slept in Sarah's rocking chair beside the stove. The tribal representatives had dispersed to carry word of their alliance to their respective nations, but Joseph remained, helping Thomas prepare for the journey to Washington that would either bring justice or get them all killed. The letter was addressed to Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Smith, a man Thomas had met years earlier during a boundary dispute that had been resolved through negotiation rather than violence. If anyone in Washington could be trusted to listen, it would be Smith, assuming he hadn't been bought like so many others. "Commissioner Smith," Thomas wrote, "I am writing to report systematic corruption and genocide being carried out under color of law in the Montana Territory. The enclosed documents prove coordinated theft of tribal lands through fraudulent treaties, military attacks on civilians to clear valuable mineral claims, and the murder of witnesses who could expose these crimes." The words came slowly, each sentence weighted with the lives that depended on its accuracy. Thomas documented everything: the Sweetgrass Massacre, Maria's murder, the network of officials who'd profited from stolen land, the evidence hidden in Blackwood's files. But more than the crimes, he wrote about the unprecedented tribal alliance that had formed in response, about the opportunity for genuine peace that existed if justice could be served. Samuel stirred in his sleep, making the soft sounds that had become as familiar to Thomas as his own breathing. In 3 days, the child had transformed Thomas's silent house into something that felt like home again. Sarah's quilts finally had someone to warm, her rocking chair had found its purpose, and Thomas had discovered that love wasn't something that died with loss. It was something that grew stronger with each person who needed protecting. "He's changing you," Joseph observed from the doorway, where he'd been watching Thomas write. "He's saving me," Thomas corrected. "The way Sarah saved him, the way Maria tried to save her people. It's all connected, isn't it? The way love passes from one person to another, the way protecting someone gives your life meaning." Joseph settled into the chair across from Thomas, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that bore the scars of 70 years of survival. "My granddaughter believed that," he said quietly. "She used to say that every act of kindness created ripples that spread farther than we could imagine. I thought it was just young idealism." "Maybe it was," Thomas said, sealing the letter and setting it aside. "But maybe that's what the world needs more of. People idealistic enough to believe that individual actions can change everything." A sound from outside made both men freeze. The approach of horses, moving fast and hard. Thomas was on his feet instantly, Samuel in his arms, while Joseph moved to the window with his rifle. "4 riders," Joseph reported, "coming from the south, pushing their horses hard." Thomas felt his blood chill. Blackwood's associates. They've come for him. The riders didn't slow as they approached the house, and Thomas could see the desperation in their pace. These weren't men coming to negotiate. They were coming to silence everyone who knew about the conspiracy, starting with Blackwood himself. "Take Samuel and get to the root cellar," Thomas told Joseph. "If this goes badly, you ride for the reservation and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," Joseph replied firmly. "You're not leaving me," Thomas said, checking his Colt and moving toward the door. "You're protecting what matters most. That boy is the future. Yours, mine, Sarah's, Maria's. He's worth more than both our lives." The first gunshot shattered the kitchen window before Thomas could reach the door. The riders had split up, surrounding the house, and Thomas could hear boots on the porch, footsteps circling toward the back door. Professional killers, moving with military precision. "Whitmore," a voice called from outside. "Send out Blackwood and the evidence, and we'll make this quick." Thomas almost laughed at the absurdity. These men had come to kill everyone anyway. They just wanted to make it easy on themselves. Instead, he called back, "Blackwood's already dead." shot trying to escape. It was a lie, but it might buy them time. If they believed Blackwood was already silenced, they might take a moment to reconsider their options. The silence stretched for heartbeats. Then a different voice replied. Then send out the papers and the child. Thomas felt cold rage wash through him. They weren't just here to clean up loose ends. They were here to finish what they'd started with Maria. Kill the witnesses, destroy the evidence, eliminate the bloodline that could seek justice. Over my dead body, Thomas whispered, then raised his voice. Come and take them. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The front door exploded inward under the force of a shotgun blast. The back door splintered as Boots kicked it open, and someone came through the shattered kitchen window in a shower of glass and gunfire. Thomas dove behind the overturned table, returning fire at the shapes moving through the smoke and chaos. Beside him, Joseph's rifle cracked with the precision of a man who'd been fighting impossible odds his entire life. In the root cellar below, Samuel began to cry, and the sound cut through Thomas's heart like a blade. The gunfight raged for minutes that felt like hours. Thomas's Colt emptied and he reloaded by feel, muscle memory from years of practice taking over while his mind focused on the tactical situation. 3 attackers down, 1 still moving, ammunition running low, time running out. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything. War cries echoing across the valley, growing closer by the second. Joseph heard it too, and his weathered face split into a fierce grin. Standing Bear, he said simply. I sent word yesterday. Told him to bring help if we weren't at the rendezvous point by sunset. The cavalry charge that followed would have made Custer proud, except these warriors were fighting for justice instead of conquest. 20 Lakota riders swept down on the house like a summer storm, catching the remaining attackers in a crossfire that ended the battle in seconds. When the dust settled, Thomas found himself standing in his destroyed kitchen, holding Samuel against his chest while the baby's cries gradually faded to hiccups. Around him, the evidence of systematic corruption lay scattered across the floor: maps, contracts, financial records, all the proof needed to expose the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Is it over? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. This part is, Joseph replied, surveying the carnage. But the real fight starts when we reach Washington. Thomas looked down at Samuel, who had calmed in his arms and was staring up at him with those knowing dark eyes. In 3 days, this child had given Thomas back his purpose, his courage, and his hope for the future. Now it was time to give Samuel something in return, a world where truth mattered more than profit, where children could grow up without fear, where the love that connected all of them could flourish in peace. Then we'd better get started, Thomas said, gathering the scattered papers. This boy has a future to claim, and I intend to make sure he gets it. Epilogue: Seeds in Spring Soil. 6 months later, Thomas stood on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., watching Samuel take his first tentative steps across the marble floor. The boy had grown strong and confident in the months since the confrontation, surrounded by love from both his adopted father and the extended family of 12 tribes who'd claimed him as their own. The congressional hearings had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from witnesses who'd been too frightened to speak before but found courage in the unprecedented tribal alliance. Blackwood and his surviving associates faced federal charges, territorial officials had been removed from office, and new treaties were being negotiated based on respect rather than exploitation. It wasn't perfect justice. Too many had died, too much had been stolen, too many wounds would never fully heal. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something better could be built. "Da-da," Samuel said, reaching up toward Thomas with chubby arms. And Thomas felt his heart expand in ways he'd never imagined possible. The word was Samuel's first, and Thomas suspected it would be far from his last. Joseph emerged from the commissioner's office, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who'd lived to see his granddaughter's death avenged through law rather than violence. "The final treaty is signed," he announced. "The mineral claims are voided, the stolen lands returned, and compensation approved for the families of massacre victims." "And the railroad?" Thomas asked, settling Samuel on his hip. "We'll have to find another route," Joseph replied with a smile. "One that doesn't require murdering children to clear the right of way." They walked together down the Capitol steps, 3 generations connected by tragedy but bonded by hope. Thomas thought of Sarah, who died protecting a future she'd never see, and of Maria, whose courage had made that future possible. Their love lived on in the child who carried their dreams forward, in the alliance their sacrifices had forged, in the justice their deaths had finally achieved. "Where to now?" Joseph asked as they reached the street. Thomas looked down at Samuel, who was babbling happily and reaching toward the afternoon sun. "Home," he said simply. "It's time to plant Sarah's garden." Samuel's old enough to help. As they climbed into the waiting carriage, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle around him like Sarah's wedding shawl, warm, comforting, and absolutely right. He'd spent 3 years afraid to protect anyone, terrified of failing again. Now he understood that the fear of failure was nothing compared to the fear of not trying. That love wasn't diminished by loss, but multiplied by the courage to love again. Samuel fell asleep in his arms as the carriage rolled through the Washington streets, and Thomas whispered a promise into the child's dark hair. "You'll grow up knowing you're protected, knowing you're loved, knowing that your mother's courage and your grandmother Sarah's kindness created the world where you can be safe. And someday, when you're ready, you'll carry that love forward to protect someone else who needs it." The ring, Sarah's turquoise ring, still hung around Samuel's neck, catching the late afternoon light like a promise kept. Thomas touched it gently, feeling the connection between past and future, between loss and hope, between the love that dies and the love that endures forever. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the sky, promising rain for the spring planting season. Thomas smiled and held his son a little tighter, ready to go home and build the future they'd all sacrificed so much to make possible. The ring glinted once more in the fading light, and Thomas could swear he heard Sarah's voice on the wind. "Well done, my love. Well done."